looking at the ark and the animals. For the last couple of weeks, we've majored on the first part of that title by looking at the ark. And so hopefully, at least by now, we all have a somewhat adequate picture in our mind of what the ark looked like. Most of what we've said, really all of what we've said thus far probably will not be repeated again, so I trust that you've gotten that. We'll give you a few more items about the ark as we go along here, and that'll be about all we can say about it. You can leave the rest up to your imagination on filling in any details of what the ark would have looked like at that time. So we want to begin to look some at the questions that are related to the subject of the animals, the occupants of the ark. We raised our first couple of questions at the end of the previous message the previous week, and we didn't get into it. Those two questions concerned the gathering and the loading of the animals. I remember we mentioned it last time, but we didn't get to that subject. The critics make a mockery of the fact that Noah and his 7 relatives would have been scampering all over the world, of course having to preach and build the ark at the same time, trying to collect animals like the sloth and the armadillo from South America and the kangaroo from Australia and the polar bear from the Arctic region and so forth. And it would have taken them, several millennia to ever have gathered all the animals and ever coaxed them into coming back south with them, or north, whichever direction you were at the time. It would have taken a lot of whatever they ate, bananas or salmon, fish, or whatever, to coax them back to Asia and to get them all on board the ark. Now, I want to make a statement here, and that statement is we must only assume the miraculous whenever the Bible leads us in that area. The reason we say that is because the scientists and the theologians that comprise the local flood school, of which Bernard Ramm is one of the most notable, eminent, and outspoken advocates, simply object to our belief in the universal flood on the fact that a belief on the basis of the fact that a belief in the universal flood would necessitate the, quote, endless supplying of miracles, end of quote. Endless supplying of miracles, and they think this is a little ridiculous. It shows our naivete to think that this is God providing a whole endless supply of miracles concerning the flood, concerning the ark, concerning Noah's gathering of the animals, his loading them, then his care of the animals. We've got several objections to their statement. First of all, we don't claim that there is an endless supplying of miracles. The flood only lasted a little over a year. We only need miracles to last a little over a year for it. Besides that, the children of Israel in the wilderness experience and Christ in the Gospels had a continuous supply of miracles at their disposal. But we don't want to be naive like most Christians are. You see, what they're arguing against is whenever most Christians come across the Genesis account, assuming that they're bright enough to recognize, or they're listening to the Spirit of God, to recognize that the flood is universal, and if some of these problems and some of these questions were brought up to them that we brought up to you, their response would simply be, well, God can do anything. God did it. And this just aggravates people like Ram something terrible. Here's a quote from his book. If one wishes to retain a universal flood, it must be understood that a series of stupendous miracles is required. And here's his main statement. Further, one cannot beg off with the pious statements that God can do anything. We concur enthusiastically with Smith when he wrote, and you know what Smith he's talking about, J.P. Smith. That the Omnipotent could effect such a work, a universal flood, none can doubt. But we are not at liberty thus to invent miracles in order to sustain our view. Now, why we mention this is we are not coming on this in a naive way by just saying, yes, the flood was universal, without considering the results of making a statement like that. When you make a statement like that, then you have to be able to explain some of the alleged problems and things that are brought up. The one area where we differ with them is that we start with the biblical premise that the flood is universal. You can't read Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 and come away with a different opinion. Then, it's not until after we, first of all, state the biblical premise and accept that the flood is universal, that then we go on to some of these problems and some of these solutions and try to fit them together. Whereas they're doing just the opposite. They start with all the problems that they see, and on that basis explain away the universality of the flood. And you can't do that. You have to start with the fact that the flood was universal.
Amen.
And then there are these questions, well, what about the animals on the ark? What about the gathering of them? What about Mount Everest? Assuming that sea level doesn't affect atmospheric pressure. Let's assume that sea level doesn't affect atmospheric pressure. Let's assume that the pre-flood mountains were the same height as the post-flood mountains. Then we've got a problem with an ark sailing 30,000 feet above sea level. Well, certainly we'd have a problem. But just because we've got the problem doesn't mean we can throw away the biblical teaching on the universal flood. You see, we have to take that teaching and then begin to look into the Scriptures and come up with either a rational, common sense explanation for it or a scriptural explanation for it. You have to put both of these together. You don't need the Scriptures to come up with an explanation concerning atmospheric pressure at the height of 29,000 feet if the water is rising to that level. You don't need a Scripture text for that. You need some common sense and some logic, and if you don't have that, a little study in that area to find out what would the pressure be, what would the amount of oxygen per part of parts of air at a height like that. So we're starting off on the right foot whenever we start off with the assumption, and it's a biblical assumption, I might add, that the flood is universal. Then all of the other things will work themselves out as we go along. They are missing the boat whenever they start off with the problems and then try to explain that the flood really couldn't be as universal as the Bible in fact says that it is. And they think that people that do that are naive. But he's also the one who calls us hyper-Orthodox people. And he said that, I'll have to find the quote, I think I remember it. He said that the hyper-Orthodox, I gave you this back in creation, the hyper-Orthodox put people in three categories according to their belief concerning the origin of all things. Either you're a fiat creationist, which we are, and which he said is naive, but this is what he said we put people in, or you believe in atheistic, ungodly evolution, or in a state of mental weakness and emotional confusion, you opt for theistic evolution. You see, he's smart enough to figure this out, that this is what we think about people like him. This is the quote. I gave it to you there. It's again in his book. He said, the overwhelming number of hyper-Orthodox articles, booklets, and books on evolution which we have read set the scene for the discussion of biology as follows. You can either believe, number one, in fiat, immediate creation, number two, atheistic, ungodly evolution, or number three, in a condition of mental weakness and intellectual confusion, you can believe in theistic evolution. And you see, they don't like the fact that we thought enough to put them in categories like that. The three paragraphs before that, he said, the hyper-Orthodox insist that all evolutionists are Satan-inspired and dishonest. We certainly do.
That's right.
All evolutionists, whether you're theistic or an atheistic, you're Satan-inspired and you're dishonest.
That's right.
Because science then for you ceases to be science and it becomes your religion.
Amen.
Nothing wrong with science. Science deals with facts. 2 plus 2, that equals 4, whether you're a believer or a non-believer. We wouldn't argue that fact with you. That's science right there. That's mathematical fact and science for you. But when you put in your own interpretations, your religious biases, then it ceases to be science and it becomes your religion. So see, I don't put a whole lot of faith in what he says about us being naive, when in fact those who call us hyper-orthodox are the ones who are naive. They're naive when you read. You'd be naive when you read Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9 and come up with a local flood theory. So we want to look at this question, or this twofold question. Remember, it's 2 questions: the gathering of the animals, the collection of the animals, and the loading of them on the ark. But before we get to that, I want to raise another question, I guess, that we need to deal with first, and that is, what type of animals were included and what type were excluded when it came to their collection and their gathering unto the ark? Now, we've got several scriptures, starting back with Genesis chapter 6, verse 19, where we've got commandments of God to Noah concerning what types of animals are included in those that are to be on the ark, and from this basis we can find out which ones were excluded, if any. Now, this whole question, if you're not looking far enough in advance, will bring us to the problem of saltwater fish and freshwater fish. So we'll be looking at this. Genesis 6:19. That's one of the problems that we've raised earlier. You're going to kill all your freshwater fish if you've got a universal flood, because then the oceans would be everywhere. Or you're going to kill your saltwater fish, because the lakes would be everywhere. Either way you go, you're going to kill one type of fish. Were the fish included on the ark? 6:19. Let's look, just all we can take is the text he's given us on what animals are to be included. Now, he's not going to tell us which ones to exclude. He just tells us which ones to include. Verse 19, and of every living thing of all flesh. Well, is a fish a living thing of flesh?
Yeah.
2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female. Verse 20, fowls, cattle, creeping things of the earth. So there's one text. Chapter 7, verses 2 and 3 is our second text, specifying what animals are to be included. Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee 7 sevens. Now that doesn't mean 7 plus 7 or 7 times 7. It means the same as later on in verse 9, the 2 and 2. 7 of this species, 7 of that species, but all of them clean. The male and his female, and the beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. Of fowls also of the air by 7s, the male and the female, to keep seed alive upon the face of all the earth. Then down to verses 8 and 9 for a third text. Of clean beasts and of beasts that are not clean, and of fowls, and of everything that creepeth upon the earth. There went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, the male and the female, as God had commanded Noah. Then down in verse 14. They, speaking of the 8 people, and every beast after his kind, and all the cattle after their kind, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and every fowl after his kind, and every bird of every sort. And then finally in chapter 8, verses 17 through 19. bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh. Sounds pretty inclusive there. Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful, and multiply upon the earth. Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him, every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth after their times went forth out of the ark. Now these are our 4 or 5 texts that give us the commands of God concerning what type of animals were to be included in the loading up of the various species on the ark. But we still got our question, were fish included? Because at least twice here it says, such as in chapter 6 and verse 19, of every living thing of all flesh. Then there in chapter 8 and verse 17, every living thing of all flesh. Repeated almost word for word over again. Well, no, fish were not included on the ark. Notice in both of these, in all of these accounts, and especially in chapter 6:19 and 8:17, after it mentions every living thing of all flesh, it goes on to enumerate, does that in every case, and in every single case it makes no mention of any type of fish there. A conspicuous absence of any type of fish. You've got beasts, you've got your cattle, you've got your birds, you've got your insects, you've got your reptiles, all of that included in beasts and cattle and creeping things and fowl of the air and of every bird of every sort. And in particular, in chapter 8, the passages we just looked at, verse 17, bring forth every living thing. Now we would accept that just as meaning that every living thing, except he qualifies it afterwards. Of all flesh, fowl, cattle, every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Now you see, when we go back to chapter 1, verses 20 through 25, we have the list of the various animal creations of God. And so you can see that the terminology that is used over in the flood accounts of chapters 6, 7, and 8 are using the same words as what we find back here in chapter 1, where it talks about the fowl there in the middle of verse 20, down in verse 24. Let the earth bring forth living creature, cattle, beasts of the field. Verse 25, beasts of the earth, cattle, things that creep upon the earth. And the one additional thing which is found there in verse 20 and verse 21, and their habitats mentioned in verse 22, is the aquatic creation. In particular, the fish, but of course that would include things like crabs and shrimp and whales and sharks and just a whole lot of other things. The various types of aquatic life that you would find living in the seas, living in the oceans, living in the rivers, living in the ponds, living in the lakes. And you see, if that was going to be included, since Genesis 6, 7, and 8 mention by name the various other categories and subcategories of the animals that were to be taken on board, obviously we would have one time where he said, and take all the fish in the sea. Doesn't say that. So that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that the fish would not be included. Now, of course, this is an exception to the two statements where he said to take 2 and 2 or 7, 7 of every living creature of all flesh. The fish, in other words, would not be included. But answering that question really doesn't do anything as far as answering what happens when we have an over-flooding of the entire surface of the globe. And you've got your saltwater fish, and your saltwater creatures and your freshwater fish and your freshwater creatures. It's no small problem to raise. Unless you know some different things, it's not very easy to answer. Here's what one writer said about this. A large portion of fishes have been formed by the Creator to live in rivers and freshwater lakes, all of which must have perished by the prevalence of a salt sea or brackish water. Even those, and then he goes on to talk about various types and various species of freshwater fish that would have been destroyed by the overflooding of land everywhere. Because if we believe that it's going to cover the entire mountains, and that certainly is going to go everywhere. And the fish that live in the various freshwater streams and ponds and lakes aren't simply going to be able to go down to the very bottom of the lake and just stay there until the flood is over, so they'll have fresh water down there. Because if we've got water covering the whole surface of the globe, most of your aquatic life, I'm talking about aquatic life, well, that lives anywhere, but especially that lives in your oceans and seas, lives within the top 50 fathoms of water because the pressure of water is much too great to live any below that. So that means all fish would have had to have gone up. They couldn't have stayed down at the bottom of some lake or stream or pond or river and been able to survive. Now there are very, very few sea creatures that live below the 50 fathom mark because the pressure of water is too great there. Now, one of the writers I remember reading, he's the one who believes it covered Mount Everest, and so there you've got 30,000 feet of water, and if he believes that the globe back then was the same as it is today, then really you've got 60,000 feet of water in some places, because Challenger Deep and the Mariner Trench is 30,000 deep. Mount Everest is 30,000 feet high. You add it together, you've got 60,000 feet of water on the globe. Even if we don't believe Mount Everest was that high, which we've told you, we haven't proven it yet, what we've told you in the past that it wasn't that high at that time, you're still going to end up with several miles of water. It's going to be several miles deep. Obviously, we would have to believe that the spot there off the South Sea Island of Guam, Challenger Deep, would have to be 30-plus thousand feet deep. It wouldn't have been that deep at that time. But regardless of how deep it is now, or how high the mountains are now, or how high they were then, or how deep it was then, regardless of that, we're still going to end up with several miles of water uniformly covering the globe, which inevitably and universally forces most of your sea life up somewhere in the top 50 fathoms of the water. They wouldn't be able to survive under the pressure. So how are we going to answer? And of course, in answering this, and I've already thought about it, but obviously people are going to bring up right away, well, what about things like the Great Salt Lake and the Dead Sea? If we've got the oceans that cover the whole globe, and of course, we haven't told you where the water went, let's just assume for a moment there was a plug in the bottom and you just pulled the plug, and there went most of the water out the bottom of the Atlantic. It didn't happen that way, but let's assume that for all practical purposes it suits our purpose well. They pulled the plug on the bottom of the Atlantic, and there went most of the water, which means only your low-lying areas would contain the water in lakes and ponds and so forth that we have today. But how did some of them end up freshwater and some of them saltwater, though? I mean, the vast majority are freshwater, besides your oceans and seas. But then there are some that are saltwater. So that's another question that has to be brought up here with a universal flood. Without a universal flood, we just go back in geologic evolution and say, well, gradually over billions and millions of years, such and such happened. As far as the Dead Sea is concerned, such and such happened. As far as the Great Salt Lake is concerned. But since we don't have billions and billions of years, and since we did have a flood that covered the whole globe, we've got to come up with some other answers. Two things to say about this. First of all, the salt content of the oceans of that day is not anywhere near as high as it is today. We'll explain how we know that here in a moment. And secondly, even if it was, that's beside the point on what the salt content was of that day. Because remember, we've got in the flood, in Noah's flood, at least as much water coming down and spreading over the earth as we had on the earth at that day, at that time. And of course, all that came down would obviously be fresh water. Regardless of where it came from, it's not going to be salt water. It obviously would have been fresh water. So regardless of what the salt content would have been at that time, if you've got this much fresh water coming down and being added, it's going to dilute the salt water and lower the salt content of the water. You still got the problem of the overspreading of the water over the whole globe, though. And the fish, remember, are going to go everywhere. How do we end up with some today that can only stand fresh water and some today that can only stand salt water? By the way, there are some fish that can take both waters. Not that many, but there are some. Because they're out there in the ocean, and when it's time to spawn, here they come up the river. And they come up they come up freshwater rivers, but they live in salt water. Evidently, they can stand both. But then there are some, you take them out of a freshwater pond and put them in the Mediterranean, they'll die just like that. Or you take some out of the Mediterranean and put them somewhere where they don't have any salt, and they'll die just like that. So is this the evolutionary process at work over millions of years and the survival of the fittest? Well, to a small degree, yes. Not over billions of years, but to a small degree, yes. You see, since that time, you better believe it has been the survival of the fittest. Just watch your dog and cat and see. It's the survival of the fittest. Whoever's the fittest survives then. Concerning what bird's going to get what nest, and what woodpecker in what hole. It's the survival of the fittest. Whoever's big enough and strong enough to take it gets it. And if a grizzly bear wants your tree, then you just let him have it then. Because you got the survival of the fittest. There's just enough truth in evolutionary thought and theory to make it very dangerous in most people's minds, because they can't make these distinctions and see where distinctions need to be made. Well, I'm just giving you time to be enlightened out there and get the answer here to our problem that we have. Now, we're giving you 2 points here that ought to help you think on the subject right away. Salt content at that time is not nearly as high. You know what causes salt content in the ocean? Water runoff and drainage. The longer the oceans and seas have been here, the higher the salt content will be. It's always growing higher because sodium chloride is in the ground everywhere. And the rainwater that runs into the streams, that runs into the rivers, which run into the oceans and seas, carries billions and billions of tons of sodium chloride into the seas, into the oceans, thereby raising their content. You take something like the Dead Sea, I believe that's 800 million tons of salt per year that the Jordan River brings into the Dead Sea. Now, 800 million tons of salt. Now, that's just a whole lot of salt. That's not water, that's salt. 800 million tons. I believe that figure's right. I believe for the Great Salt Lake, it's fed by the Jordan River too, just a different Jordan River in Utah. There's 3 other rivers. I think the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan are the 3 rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake. 1.1 billion or 1.1 million tons of salt taken into the Great Salt Lake every year. Great Salt Lake's about 1,600 square acres. Dead Sea's about 400 square acres. But the Dead Sea contains about 12 billion tons of salt as compared to about 6 billion tons of salt in the Great Salt Lake. Big difference there because the Great Salt Lake is, 4 times as large as the Dead Sea. Now that's getting off the subject, getting into answering the question about those two, but the first thing you need to understand is that It's over a process of time where we have the raising of the salt content of our seas and of our oceans by water drain-off. Now, when you've got this great waterfall during the time of the flood, then you've got, of course, obviously, you've got a lowering of the salt content. We'll just call it of the ocean because it would have been one universal ocean that covered the whole globe. If you've got at least as much water as was on the earth at that time added to it, then you're going to dilute the salt content. You're going to lower the salt content. Therefore, that's going to be a little better for freshwater fish and a little worse for saltwater fish. But the salt content at that time was not very great anyway. In other words, what would have happened would have been, we would have had a dilution of the salt content and this would have been, again, God's providence. It would have been a dilution of the salt content to the exact point. It would have been an extreme point that could have been withstood by each of the fish, by your saltwater fish, just enough salt content for them to stay alive, and not too much salt content in order to keep the freshwater fish alive. And it would have had to have hit a precise mark there. Now you see there's no other way you can explain it. Because if you've got a salt content like we have today that spreads over the whole world, you kill all your fish like that, all your freshwater fish. So it would have had to have hit a medium there that would have maintained life for both fish, both species of fish. Then we can ask, well, what happened, assuming we pulled the plug on the bottom of the Atlantic,
for the continuation of this message
for both fish, both species of fish? Then we can ask, well, what happened, assuming we pulled the plug on the bottom of the Atlantic, and Lake Huron and Lake Ontario and Lake Superior being lower than where we are right now, filled up with water, it would have filled up with the same identical water that was in the Atlantic Ocean of that day. The water in the Atlantic would have been the same salt content as the water within Lake Superior. And Lake Superior would have had the same salt content as the Pacific Ocean. You see, it would have been exactly the same because you'd have the same water universally. Then we still got the problem about the fish that are going to live in these respective places. Now, let's say the lake here behind the place, there are no whales that live out there. Let's assume, we don't even know, something I didn't mention, we don't even know that there were lakes prior to the flood. We're just assuming that since there were rivers in Genesis 2, there were probably lakes then. And I suppose that's safe to assume that. There were probably lakes at that time. But let's just take the lake out here behind the place. There aren't any sharks that live out there. Only a certain type of fish. Well, whenever the floodwaters receded and left, were there a certain type of fish hovering right over that body of water? And as the water lowered, then all the sharks somehow happened to be just over the Atlantic Ocean, and all the brim and the crappie and everything else happened to be just over freshwater, what would end up to be freshwater lakes? Well, certainly not. They would have been everywhere. That's why we end up with shark bones in California mountains. They would have been everywhere. But you see, there would have been a very quick dying off of certain animals in certain places. Let's assume there was a whale out there. He wouldn't have lived very long. He would die. That would have been several thousand years ago, would have no remains, so there'd be no way to prove that he was ever out there. There would have been a lot of catfish and largemouth bass and crappie out in the Atlantic Ocean. They would have been in that era whenever the waters began to go. And they couldn't think, well, now it's time to go to where we're going to find some fresh water. That's where they'd be stuck. That's where they'd end up. That's where they'd die. But how is it that we end up today with fish on two polarized ends of the pole, one that stands fresh water and one that can't stand fresh water? Well, this is what would have taken place. Your various fish would have ended up in different places. Obviously, your large fish simply couldn't have survived if they would have ended up in certain places like the lake out here behind the building. Large fish would not have been able to survive then. It had been a whole year with the water covering the whole globe. Therefore, the animals, the fish, in other words, would have been able to adapt during that year-long period to whatever salt content that the universal ocean had. Like I said, it would have been just enough to maintain the life of saltwater fish, but not too much to kill freshwater fish. It would have been right on the border, would have maintained the life of both of them. But whenever the water begins to leave, we end up with big fish out here. Obviously, doesn't matter whether you've got saltwater or freshwater, they're going to die out there anyway. They just can't live in a small, confined area. So that's beside the point. But we've got our smaller fish. We've got, let's say, some of our ocean fish that happen to end up in an area like this. They're not going to be able to survive there because over a period of time, two different things happen. One's going to happen to your freshwater, one's going to happen to your saltwater. In all of your saltwater areas, it's obviously going to continue to increase in salt content. Notice that all your rivers, your large rivers, Mississippi, Minnesota, eventually the Nile, the Amazon, do any of those rivers empty into lakes? They all empty into seas or oceans. They contain and carry the major drainage system, well, let's say the Amazon, for the whole continent of South America. And the Nile for a large portion of Africa, a large portion of northeastern Africa. And as it rains, this takes hundreds and then thousands of years. It continues to increase. As it rains on the land runs off into the various tributaries. These tributaries feed into the rivers. These rivers feed into the oceans or into the seas. The seas feed into the ocean, and the salt content begins to increase, but notice gradually, though. It doesn't happen just like that. And therefore, for the most part, the large majority of fish simply grow over a period of time to adapt that salt content. It's not going to kill them off just like that. Now, the fish that we happen to know are extinct today, probably what happened to them was simply they couldn't survive the gradual increase in the content of salt in the oceans. I'm talking about saltwater fish now. Because they're very obviously, and this can be proven from the fossil remains, they're very obviously are extinct fish. Fish that once lived and aren't around today. Now, they didn't die out in evolutionary process a billion years ago. But they did die out over a gradual period of time with the increase of salt content in saltwater bodies. They couldn't contain it. They couldn't put up with something like that. They would eventually die. Now, what would happen in your freshwater bodies? Most of your freshwater bodies have both an inlet and an outlet. The oceans are what are different. They have no outlet. Your ocean can't flow into another river somewhere. Of course, the only outlet it has is evaporation, and that simply comes back to it later on. But most rivers have most lakes have both an inlet and an outlet. And the input of water and the outtake of water decreases the salt content. Now, if it has no outlet, then that's what's going to increase the salt content. The Dead Sea, the Great Salt Lake, have no outlet. There's one river, one main river, Jordan. There are about 3 tributaries, small wadis they call them. The Bedouins call them the wadis. 3 wadis in the Jordan River that flow into the Dead Sea, but it has no outlet. Therefore, with the Jordan River bringing in 800,000 tons of salt per year, salt doesn't have anywhere to go. And what increases your salt content is when your evaporation exceeds the input of waters that your rivers bring into it. You see, these aren't growing larger, these are growing smaller. And what you end up with all around the perimeter of these various lakes or seas, the Dead Sea is really not a sea, it's a lake there, and you can see in pictures great salt flats out there where water used to be, and as the water is evaporated, evaporation can't take salt up in the air, it takes the moisture out and leaves the salt deposits there. And you see, this is one thing that's made Israel rich. The potassium and just plain salt, just table salt, that's where you get it from. Out of places like this, when you've got a lake like that that's got 10, 12 billion tons of it, in 400 square acres. That's a rather large industry there. And of course, the Dead Sea is so buoyant that you can float in it, or you can't sink in it. That's what makes the Great Salt Lake such a famous recreational area today. That's where you've got the Bonneville Salt Flats, where they're always trying to set the land speed record, because you've got nothing but what are the remains of where water used to be. The water's evaporated, you've got just that flat land. And you've probably seen some of the races there where they get these drag strips and these cars, and perfectly flat for as far as you can see. And that's where you want to run a race, on the Bonneville Salt Flats. But the Great Salt Lake has no tributary that leads out of it. It's locked in. Therefore, in these three rivers, the Bear, the Weber, and the Jordan, that flow into the Great Salt Lake, they're continually bringing every year 1.1 million tons of salt. That salt doesn't have anywhere to go. Over a process of time, you're going to end up with the Great Salt Lake, with the Dead Sea. It's not going to happen in most places. First of all, most places aren't large enough. You've got to have a fairly large lake for this to happen, or a fairly large sea for this to happen. And secondly, most lakes, if they don't have an input, they at least have an output. Most of them have a river that flow into them and feed them. And those that don't, well, just take the one out here. You've got an output. You've got water continually running out of that lake. Of course, it's going to be filled up by rain, but you've got more than one outflow. And as long as you can keep that circulation, water going out, water coming in, water going out, water coming in, not by evaporation, but by some tributary leading out, then you're not going to have any problem with salt content building up there. But if you get a large enough lake or sea, lock it in. You see, your sea's like the Mediterranean, because it's almost locked in there. The Strait of Gibraltar is the only thing that opens into the Atlantic Ocean. And the salt content of the Mediterranean is much larger than the Atlantic Ocean, because it's more locked in. It doesn't have the flow that something as large as the Atlantic Ocean would have. Therefore, you've got an easy explanation for all these questions concerning your salt fish and saltwater fish, freshwater fish. No problem at all. There would have been, in certain places, a gradual dying out of those animals that couldn't stand the content of the salt wherever they were. Even saltwater fish in salt water, if the salt content got too high for them, then you're going to end up with what we know today as our extinct fish. Now, of course, that's really not going to happen in freshwater fish. The only way something would get extinct is maybe man's exploitation of a certain game fish or something. But it's not going to die for a lack of salt there, because it was used to a lack of salt in the first place. And it was the overflowing of the seas that brought the salt in that caused an adaptation in its environment and in its receptibility in the first place. But once this changes, then we're going to have a change back to the normal pattern of what the fish was used to in the very beginning. Another thing to consider about some of these so-called exceptions, and by that I mean these great salt lakes, if all the water drained off, and why did just salt water happen to stay there and fresh water everywhere else? It didn't happen like that. If you've got lakes that happen to be built upon, they were just naturally built upon a large salt dome or salt dune underneath it where you've got a lot of sodium chloride, obviously that's going to seep up and that's going to build up the content also. And this is what you've got in both places. Most places you're not going to have the lake that just happens to be on top of where you've got a lot of sodium chloride or salt underneath that. But if you do, and you combine that with the fact that this lake or this sea doesn't have any outlet, and it's got more than one inlet, then the only thing you can hope for is after several hundred or several thousand years to end up with something like the Great Salt Lake or the Dead Sea. Now, we simply can't go back far enough in history to find out when all this took place, but obviously the Great Salt Lake was not always as salty as it is today, just like the oceans were not as salty as they are today. They are extremely salty. I remember when we were down at the Gulf of Mexico, swimming in the Gulf, and you get anything in your mouth and it's just terrible taste because it has so much salt in it. But 5,000 years ago wouldn't have been like that. And if we live for 5,000 more years, it's going to only get worse. Perhaps more fish will die out, you see. Perhaps that's what's taking place now. I mean, the oceans are so vast and so deep, we could never hope to know everything that actually lives in there.
Amen.
The scientists think they know every living species on the earth, but they don't. Because they've never been to the bottom of the ocean in every place to find out, well, what actually lives down here. Now, you see, going back to the Great Salt Lake, of course, no fish live in something like that. Because that's where your fish would have ended up, and with that salt content, landlocked, it's going to become, of course, it's much greater salt content in the ocean. I mean, a much higher percentage. There won't be any fish that'll be able to survive something like that. There are only a small number of crustaceans, like the brine shrimp. The brine shrimp, there are thousands of them in the Great Salt Lake. And a few other varieties of small crustaceans that are able to put up with the salt content like that. Otherwise, that's why they call it the Dead Sea. Nothing lives in it. A little bit of algae is about the only plant life you'll find in it. And the content of these, of course, produces a very strange result. For instance, the Dead Sea, in the morning, the Dead Sea has wind blowing off of it in all directions. And it comes from the middle of the sea. If you're on the north side, south side, east, and west, you've got the wind blowing you in your face. And that's pretty much impossible. I mean, you'd think, well, if you're on the north and it's blowing you in the face, then if you're on the south, it'd be behind you then. It would have come across. It doesn't do that. It just blows this way. And in the evening, it's different. The wind switches and everything blows towards the center of the Dead Sea. So there are a lot of mysteries about the Dead Sea and the Salt Lake that we still don't understand today. Because that content of salt, much larger than what you'll find in the oceans, much larger than what you'd find in bodies of water like the Mediterranean Sea, simply causes strange things to occur. There's always a mist in the morning over the Dead Sea whenever the sun begins to rise and heat the water. And remember, the evaporation of the water is greater than the inflow of the river, and that's why the Jordan River. And that's what raises that salt content. You've got, in other words, you've got less and less water to mix the salt with. And you've got less and less water to mix the salt with. At the same time, you've got more and more salt being put in. You know what's going to happen. Eventually, everything will die in there. It'll be nothing but just one salt bottle there. All the water will be gone if we stayed around long enough, and there'd be huge salt dunes and deposits of salt and potassium and all types of other chemicals that would still remain there. Okay, does that answer the question for you well enough on the salt and the freshwater fish? If it does, we're going to go on. I think we've got time to go on and get into some more questions, getting back to our one on the gathering of the animals. Okay, let's go to that question that I meant to begin dealing with here tonight. We've got two different questions. We've got the gathering or the collection of the animals. We've got the boarding of them upon the ark. Two different questions entirely with two different answers. Let me give you a couple of theories that some people have dreamed up on how the animals were gathered. The Bible, by the way, gives us the answer on how he gathered the kangaroo from Australia and the armadillo from South America. But there are some insufficient theories. First theory, I don't remember, I believe Donald Patton is the one who holds this in his book, The Biblical Flood and the Ice Epic, but it's known as the astral theory. A-S-T-R-A-L, the astral theory. Now you see, they build up, first of all, in their works, they build up and paint us a very vivid scene of Noah and his wife and them breaking their back trying to get the ark put together, and Noah perspiring, thundering from the pulpit as he's preaching, and then they ask the stunning question, how could they have gathered all the animals from all over the world while they're busy doing things like that? So they psychologically dupe you, first of all, before they bring up their theory. And then you think, well, I don't have any better answer than that theory, so why not accept it? Now, I've got a quote here because there's no better way to say it than a quote from his book, and that is the following. Apparently there were significant forewarnings, micro vibrations, or minute foreshocks of the coming catastrophe, seismic in nature. That sums up the whole astral theory. Apparently there were significant forewarnings, micro vibrations, or minute foreshocks of the coming catastrophe, seismic in nature. Now the name of the theory tells you at least a little bit about it, the astral theory. His theory is that the planet Mercury swerved by the Earth at this time, and its close encounter with the Earth produced this quote that I just gave you. Significant forewarnings, micro vibrations, minute foreshocks of the coming catastrophe, seismic in nature, and this made all the animals run toward the ark. But it doesn't explain why 2 unclean and 7 clean came. Why'd they pick that number to come? Can't answer that question for us. And it's a little bit ridiculous. It would have, if Mercury ever came that close to the Earth, it would have caused a lot more problems than just micro vibrations and some seismic foreshocks that would have happened. That is totally absurd. A second theory is called the storm theory. On the surface, a little more believable. But as one fellow said in his writing, each of these various attempts at the harmonization of science and Scripture mixes up more or less of science with more or less of Scripture and produces a result more or less absurd. And I couldn't agree any more. The storm theory says the following: during a storm, younger animals seek the warmth and the security and the shelter of some large structure like the ark. And all of them, when they saw the storm and the flood coming, the younger animals would have all taken off for the ark. Let me give you some answers to this theory. First of all, that certainly wouldn't make all the animals docile. If anything, it would make them a little more antagonistic and ferocious when a storm came. And how are you going to get all those animals, some of them very ferocious, just to come on board with you? You're not going to just be able to talk them into just coming on board with you. Secondly, going back to the astral theory, what made 2 unclean and 7 clean come? Thirdly, there'd never been a storm before this. How do they know what a storm was like, that they're supposed to run for shelter? It had never rained. Never even a raindrop had fallen before. And conclusively and fourthly, it didn't storm until all of them got on the ark. That's the one thing they haven't seen in chapter 7. We're told in verses 2 and 3 to gather the animals. Then we're told in verse 7, gather them because in 7 days I'm going to send the flood. Verses 8 and 9, they gather in verse 10, and it came to pass 7 days later that the floods came. They were already on board whenever the storm started. So the storm theory won't work by saying that it produced some type of, turmoil in their heart and they headed for the ark, because there would have been warmth and shelter for them. A third theory is known as the capture theory, which says that the men of that period possessed the long-lost ability of capturing and training animals. And they give us chapter 6 and verse 19 for a text. But all chapter 6 and 19 tells us is that Noah took the animals on board. And that's why I said there are 2 different questions, the gathering and the loading up. The answer to the second question is this. Certainly Noah and them loaded them up on board whenever they got there. But we have to assume in the first place a supernatural repressing of any of their ferocious characteristics they would have possessed. because we don't read the account here. It's not even intimated that Noah and his family had to fight with lions and tigers and capture them in traps and things to get them on board. Whenever they got to the ark, we still hadn't answered the question how they got there. Whenever they got there, they were simply taken on board by Noah. This is said right in verse 19 of chapter 6. Of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark. But that's not the same as saying that he gathered the animals, though. That's a different question. Certainly, he's the one who actually took them on board whenever they got there, because we're told that. And we're actually told the answer to the other question in a very obvious manner.
Amen.
Now, here again, we're going back to Jameson Fawcett Brown and what he said. He was one of the local flood proponents of the last century. Notice how he plays on the mind and the emotions and the imagination. On the hypothesis, therefore, of a universal flood, we must imagine motley groups of beasts, birds, and reptiles directing their way from the most distant and opposite quarters to the spot where Noah had prepared his ark. Natives of the polar regions and the torrid zones preparing to sojourn in a temperate country, the climate of which was unsuited alike to Arctic and equatorial animals. What time must have been consumed! Exclamation point. What privations must have been undergone for lack of appropriate food! Exclamation mark. What difficulties must have been encountered! Exclamation mark. What extremes of climate must have been endured by the natives of Europe, America, Australia, Asia, Africa, and the numerous islands of the sea! Exclamation mark. They could not have performed their journeys unless they had been miraculously preserved. Nay, after the flood had subsided and they were to be dispersed to their several homes, years would have been spent in crossing seas and continents, in traversing mountains and plains, nor could they have reached without a repetition of the miracle the precise regions which each was destined to inhabit. Indeed, says Hitchcock, the idea of their collection and dispersion in a natural way is altogether too absurd to be believed, and we must therefore either resort to a miracle or suppose a new creation to have taken place after the deluge. These and other difficulties which beset the theory of a universal flood have led the generality of modern writers to advocate the notion that the deluge was partial, limited to the area inhabited by man. And by that he means Mesopotamia. Here's what another local flood writer says about the gathering of the animals. We are still left with no certain knowledge of the number and types of animals present in the ark. Most of the difficulties disappear at once if we keep to the simple lines of biblical interpretation set out above, which means local flood theory. Kangaroos would have had to come a long way from Australia and as far to return. But if Australia was not part of the, quote, whole land known to Noah, there was no need for the kangaroo to come. The giraffe would have required a special stall to enable him to stretch his neck. But if Central Africa was not part of the world Noah knew, then no problem arises. The mastodon of South America must have made a long journey to reach Samaria, and the giant panda from China would have required a special stock of bamboo shoots for his year's food. But it seems that the Bible does not really require mastodons and giant pandas in the ark. Dogmatism is obviously out of place when we really do not know the answers, but it is far more reasonable to suppose that Noah collected, maybe tamed, oxen, sheep, goats, horses, asses, camels, deer, cat, dog, beaver, fox, pig, mole, rabbit, and many birds. Where did he get that list? We've got a list here in the Bible and it says all creatures that inhabit the land. That's our list. Where did he get this? Beavers, dogs, fox, pigs? What about the mountain lion? He didn't have that here. Where does he get his lips? He just dreamed that up himself. Of course, basically, it's a domesticated lip. Most of that is a domesticated lip. And he said they were domesticated animals that were brought forth. Well, you see, them making us look ridiculous by painting the picture of the deserts and the polar regions shows that they don't understand and don't believe that the earth had no deserts and polar regions at that time. So an animal that lived in the Arctic Circle would have been in the same climate as one who lived in Babylon.
Right, amen.
So that rules out one problem. No problem as far as where they would have lived. As far as their food was concerned, you've got basically the same type of food. You've got, of course, some meat eaters. They would simply have eaten meat. And you've got some vegetarians that would have simply eaten vegetation. And concerning them being located in South America and Africa and Australia, the biblical record certainly points toward the assumption that there were representatives of all of these animals living in Mesopotamia.
Hallelujah.
It wasn't until a later time that they became isolated in certain regions due to a whole variety of circumstances, some of which we've mentioned before. Of course, there was such a great change in climate and their adaptability, they would have simply maintained existence only in certain regions later on. Now, we're not answering the question tonight how they got to the regions where we find them today after the flood. You see, that's another question. Because we know that the kangaroo does live in Australia. That's the only place he lives today. So that's another question, how he got back. All we're asking is how did they get from Australia to the ark in the first place? The answer is he didn't have to come from Australia. The animals were all represented by various species right in that region.
Right.
Therefore, they would have been all around Noah. Now, we've still got the problem of getting them to come to the ark, though. How do we answer that? We answer it with three texts, dear friends, and I want to show you these. Genesis 6:20, Genesis 7:9, and Genesis 7:15. We've got three explicit texts that give us the answer for this. And thank God we do, because he had to have brought to him in some manner reptiles, insects, giraffes, bears of all types, man-eating lions and tigers. That's no small thing. So it's good that the Bible does answer that question for us.
Hallelujah.
Quickly, let's conclude, and I'll answer this question. Chapter 6:19 tells that Noah took the animals into the ark when he got them. Chapter 6 and verse 20 tells us how he got them. Of fowls after their kind, and cattle after their kind, of every creeping thing of the earth after his kind, two of every sort, they shall come unto thee to keep them alive. It was a miracle of divine direction that led a certain number of every living species to the ark. And 3 times it explicitly said, they shall come unto thee. It says nothing about you going and gathering them. Oh, when you've got them, you've got to put them on the ark. But it never says anything about the gathering or the collection of the animals.
For a complete